It was a slow Saturday afternoon when the off-duty police captain decided to stop by the local department store. The week had been long, full of meetings, paperwork, and late-night calls, and she finally had a few hours to herself. She wasn't in uniform today. Instead, she wore a soft gray hoodie, jeans, and a cap pulled low, hoping to blend into the crowd like any other shopper. For once, she just wanted to be invisible, to walk through the aisles without anyone recognizing her or asking work questions. The store was crowded, filled with people looking for weekend deals, families with kids, teenagers laughing near the electronics section, older folks pushing carts filled with household supplies, just the usual weekend crowd. She grabbed a basket and started walking slowly through the aisles, checking a small list she had written on her phone. Toothpaste, shampoo, a few snacks for the week, and a new pair of gloves for her upcoming shift. Nothing fancy, just everyday items. She liked moments like this, small, ordinary moments that felt peaceful compared to the rush of police life. She greeted the cashier at the front as she walked by, giving a polite smile, and then headed toward the clothing section to check if they had the gloves she liked. She took her time browsing, picking things up, checking sizes, putting them back, not realizing a pair of watchful eyes were following her from across the aisle. A store employee, a young man who had just started working there a few weeks ago, noticed her moving from aisle to aisle and whispered something to his colleague at the counter. "She's been walking around for a while," he said softly. "She keeps looking at things but hasn't gone to the counter yet. Do you think she's going to buy anything?" His coworker shrugged. "Maybe. Just keep an eye on her," the other replied. They didn't mean any harm. They were just being cautious. But that small misunderstanding was about to grow into something much bigger. The captain continued her shopping, unaware that she was now being quietly watched by store staff. She finally found a pair of gloves she liked, black leather with soft lining inside. She smiled, remembering how her old ones had worn out during the winter patrols. She placed them in her basket along with the other items and walked toward the self-checkout machines. She scanned each item carefully, paid using her card, and placed the printed receipt inside the bag. Everything was normal. She even paused for a moment to check her phone before heading toward the exit. But just as she was about to step outside, a voice called out sharply behind her. "Ma'am, excuse me. Can you stop for a moment?" She turned around, surprised. Two store employees were walking quickly toward her. One of them looked nervous, clutching a small radio in his hand. "We need to check your bag, please," he said. "There seems to be an issue." The captain frowned slightly. "An issue?" she repeated, her tone calm but puzzled. "I just paid for my items. You can see the receipt in the bag." She gently pulled out the small slip of paper to show them. But before they could respond, a uniformed mall security guard appeared beside them, his face serious. "We got a report of possible shoplifting," he said firmly. "We'll need you to step back inside for a quick check." She blinked, taken aback. "Shoplifting? You must be mistaken," she said, trying to stay polite. "I just came from the checkout. Everything's paid for." The young store clerk exchanged a nervous glance with the guard. "We just need to make sure," he said quietly. "It's standard procedure." The captain looked around. People had begun to notice what was happening. A few turned their heads, whispering, curious. Someone even held up their phone as if to record. That small circle of attention made her heart sink. She had seen these situations before. How quickly things could spiral once people jumped to conclusions. But this time she wasn't there as an officer. She was standing there as the accused. She sighed softly. "All right," she said. "Let's go inside. I have nothing to hide." They led her back toward the customer service area, where the security guard called for local police assistance. It was store policy, he explained. She tried not to feel frustrated, though her patience was wearing thin. She'd spent her entire career teaching officers to handle situations calmly and respectfully, and now here she was being treated as a suspect for buying groceries. After about 10 minutes, two uniformed police officers entered the store. They were from the same city department, but neither recognized her without her badge or uniform. One of them, a tall man with a serious face, approached her. "We received a report of a possible theft," he said in a firm tone. "Can you tell me what happened?" She nodded calmly, folding her arms. "I'm an off-duty police captain," she said. "I came here to shop, paid for everything, and was stopped as I was leaving. The receipt's right here." The officer raised an eyebrow, clearly not believing her right away. "An off-duty captain?" He repeated, skeptical. From which precinct? She told him, but he didn't seem convinced. All right, he said slowly. Let's just check everything, ma'am. If it's all paid for, there won't be an issue. She handed him the bag. The other officer checked each item carefully against the receipt, nodding as everything matched. The first officer crossed his arms. It looks fine, he muttered, glancing at his partner. But we still have to verify her ID. She reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet, handing over her police identification card. He looked at it, squinted, and then said something that made her heart drop a little. This could be fake, he muttered. We've seen people make fake IDs before. Her patience was slipping now. I've been with the department for over 20 years, she said evenly. You can call dispatch and confirm it yourself. He hesitated, then finally radioed in to confirm her identity. The silence that followed felt heavy. The store was quiet, except for the soft hum of background music and the murmur of shoppers who had gathered near the aisle watching. She stood still, her posture calm but her heart heavy. She never thought she'd find herself on this side of a misunderstanding, being looked at like she had done something wrong when she hadn't. Finally, the radio crackled. Dispatch confirmed her name, rank, and department. The officer froze, his expression changing from suspicion to disbelief. His partner's face turned red. She's really a captain, he stammered. The first officer looked embarrassed. Ma'am, I apologize, he said awkwardly. There must have been some confusion. She took a slow breath, forcing a small, tired smile. It's all right, she said quietly. I understand you were just doing your job. But next time, try listening before assuming. The employees nearby shifted uncomfortably, realizing the mistake they'd made. The guard mumbled an apology, saying they had only followed protocol. She nodded again, not wanting to make a scene, but the sting of humiliation was hard to shake. As she walked out of the store, she could still feel the weight of people's eyes on her. Some of them were whispering. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief. A few were still recording. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the parking lot in soft orange light. She stopped beside her car, placed her bag on the seat, and sat quietly for a moment. She took a deep breath, trying to let go of the frustration building inside. She'd dealt with plenty of tough situations in her career. Angry suspects, tense standoffs, unfair accusations from the public. But this one felt different. This was personal. She wasn't angry at the officers, not really. She understood how easily suspicion could cloud judgment when you were trained to look for signs of wrongdoing. But she couldn't help thinking how quickly they had assumed the worst. How even someone who had spent decades upholding the law could be treated like a criminal because of a misunderstanding. As she started her car, she noticed her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her face looked tired, but her eyes were steady. She told herself it was just a mistake, one that she'd eventually laugh about. But deep down, she knew this incident would stay with her for a long time. It wasn't just about being accused. It was about realizing how fragile trust could be, even among those who wore the same badge. Before driving off, she glanced back at the store. People were still walking in and out as if nothing had happened. The world kept moving, unaware of the small storm that had just passed inside. She turned the key, the engine hummed softly, and she drove away into the fading light, thinking about how quickly an ordinary afternoon had turned into something she'd never forget. The following morning felt heavier than usual. The captain woke up early, long before the sun had fully risen. She sat on the edge of her bed, the sound of silence wrapping around her like a blanket she couldn't shake off. The memory of the day before kept replaying in her mind. The moment she was stopped, the looks on people's faces, the disbelief in the officers' voices. It wasn't just the embarrassment that bothered her, but how easily things had escalated. She had spent her whole career teaching her team to observe carefully, to listen before judging, to treat everyone, no matter who they were, with fairness. Yet when the situation turned toward her, that same fairness seemed to disappear. She made herself a cup of coffee, staring at the steam rising from the mug. Outside, the city was just waking up. Cars passed by, birds chirped, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the faint sound of sirens. Normally, that sound gave her a sense of purpose. Today, it only reminded her of how fragile respect could be, even among those who were supposed to protect one another. When she reached for her phone, there were already messages waiting. A few from colleagues, One from her assistant chief asking if everything was all right, and another from a friend on the force who had seen a short video clip online. Someone had recorded part of the store incident and posted it. The clip didn't show everything, just the moment when the officers were questioning her near the exit. The caption under the video read, "Police officer accused of shoplifting. Turns out she's one of them." Her chest tightened as she scrolled through the comments. Some people defended her, saying mistakes happen and the officers probably didn't know who she was. Others were less kind, questioning how something like that could even occur. She set the phone down. She didn't want to read anymore. Later that morning, she got dressed in her uniform, the familiar dark blue fabric feeling heavier than usual. The badge on her chest caught a small ray of sunlight as she pinned it on, and she paused for a moment staring at it. She'd earned that badge through years of hard work, late nights, and countless sacrifices. It wasn't just a symbol of authority, it was a symbol of trust. And yesterday, that trust had been tested in a way she hadn't expected. When she arrived at the station, a few officers greeted her with polite smiles, but she could sense the awkward tension in the air. Everyone had heard about the incident by now. Some wanted to ask, but no one dared. It wasn't every day that a police captain was mistaken for a shoplifter by her own colleagues. She walked straight to her office, closed the door gently behind her, and sat down. Her assistant knocked a few minutes later and entered with a cautious look. "Ma'am," he said softly, "the chief wants to speak with you when you're ready." She nodded. "Tell him I'll be there in a few minutes." When she finally walked into the chief's office, he stood from his chair, his face serious but sympathetic. "I heard about what happened," he began. "I saw the video too." She stayed silent, her hands clasped in front of her. "This shouldn't have happened," he continued. "The department's looking into it, but I wanted to ask how you're holding up." She exhaled slowly. "I'm all right," she said, though the truth was she wasn't sure she believed that herself. "It's not about what happened as much as what it represents. I've worked with officers my whole life, and I've always told them, don't assume, don't jump to conclusions. Yesterday, that message was forgotten." The chief nodded. "I know," he said quietly, "and it's embarrassing for everyone involved. But you handled it with grace. The way you stayed calm, it speaks volumes." She gave a small, tired smile. "I didn't see much choice. Losing my temper wouldn't have helped." There was a pause before he added, "The two officers who stopped you, they've already come forward to apologize. They were shaken when they realized who you were. They thought they were just following protocol." She nodded. "I don't want them punished. But I do think we need to talk about why it happened. Not just to them, to everyone." The chief agreed. "We're planning a meeting this week. I think your perspective would help." After leaving his office, she spent most of the day catching up on reports and reviewing training materials, but her mind kept drifting back to the incident. Every small moment from the day before replayed in her head. The store clerk's nervous tone, the guard's stern expression, the officer's doubtful eyes. It wasn't anger she felt anymore. It was reflection. She thought about how appearances could change everything. Without her badge, without the uniform, she had become just another person in a hoodie and jeans. Someone strangers could easily misread. It made her realize how many people every single day faced the same thing she did but didn't have a badge to protect them. By the afternoon, word had spread further. News reporters were calling the department, asking for comments. Someone from the public relations team reached out to her, suggesting she stay out of the spotlight for a few days. "Let it cool down," they said gently. She agreed. But deep down she knew hiding wouldn't solve anything. That evening she drove back home in silence. The city lights reflected off her windshield, blurring slightly as she blinked away the fatigue in her eyes. When she got home, she didn't turn on the TV or music. Instead, she went straight to her balcony and stood there for a while, looking out over the quiet street below. She thought about all the young officers she had mentored over the years. She had told them again and again, always see the person first, not just the situation. It was simple advice, but yesterday proved how easily that could be forgotten. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from one of the officers involved, the younger one who had checked her bag. "Ma'am, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't recognize you. I was just trying to follow procedure. I realize now I could have handled it differently." She stared at the message for a long moment before replying, "I know. Mistakes happen. Learn from it. Always look closer before you assume. She hit send and put the phone away. The next morning, she went for an early walk. The air was cool and the streets were still quiet. As she walked, she noticed a woman struggling to start her car near the corner. Without thinking twice, she walked over and offered to help. After a few minutes, they got it running, and the woman thanked her with a relieved smile. That small exchange reminded her of why she'd joined the force in the first place: to help people, not to judge them. To understand before accusing. By the time she returned home, she felt a little lighter. Maybe everything that had happened wasn't just an embarrassment. Maybe it was meant to remind her and others and of something deeper. The next few days passed quietly, though the story still circulated online. Some people criticized the officers. Others admired the way she had handled it. She didn't respond to any of it. She preferred silence over headlines. But she was determined that if this moment had to exist, it would at least lead to something good. At the end of the week, the department held a meeting. Dozens of officers, both senior and new recruits, filled the training room. When she walked in, the chatter quieted. She stood at the front, not as someone who was wronged, but as someone who wanted to teach. She spoke honestly, without anger or pride. She told them how it felt to be seen not as a person, but as a problem, even for just a few minutes. She described the embarrassment, the confusion, and the quiet humiliation that followed. "You may think it was just a misunderstanding," she said softly, and maybe it was. But it shows how quickly we can forget to look at the person behind the situation. I don't want this to be about blame. I want it to be about awareness. Because the next time you stop someone, remember, that person has a story too. The room was silent for a long time after she finished speaking. Some officers looked down, others nodded slowly. She could tell her words had reached them. And that was enough. Later that night, when she finally got home, she sat by the window again, feeling the cool night air. The memory of that day at the store still stung, but it didn't carry the same weight anymore. She had turned something painful into something meaningful, a lesson not just for her, but for everyone around her. She didn't know how long people would remember the incident, or if it would fade like most stories do. But she knew one thing for certain. The next time she walked into a store or onto a street, or into a difficult situation, she would carry that awareness with her, not as a scar, but as a reminder that even those who serve can be misunderstood, a reminder that compassion is as important as duty, and above all, a reminder that sometimes the hardest lessons come when you least expect them. The weekend passed slowly, though it didn't really feel like rest. The captain spent most of her time at home, keeping things quiet, but her mind wouldn't stop replaying that day in the store. Every time she thought she'd moved on, another thought would pull her back. The sound of the guard's voice, the doubtful look from the officers, the curious eyes of strangers around her. It wasn't anger anymore. It was something deeper, like a bruise that hadn't healed yet. On Monday morning, she decided to return to work early. The department was busy as usual, phones ringing, officers walking in and out, the hum of conversation filling the hallways. She greeted a few familiar faces, trying to act normal, but she could feel it. The looks, the whispered tones. People were still talking about what had happened. When she stepped into her office, a small envelope was sitting on her desk. It was a handwritten note from one of the younger officers, the same one who had spoken to her at the meeting a few days earlier. The note was simple. "Thank you for how you handled everything. It made me think differently about how we treat people." She read it twice, then set it aside with a small smile. Maybe, she thought, something good was coming out of all this after all. Later that day, the chief called her into his office again. He looked more serious than before. "There's something you should know," he began. "The department received a few calls from reporters. They're asking if you'd be willing to speak publicly about what happened." She looked surprised. "Publicly? You mean in an interview?" He nodded. "Yes, the story's spread beyond the city. It's all over social media now. People are talking about bias, about police accountability, about trust. Some are angry at the officers who stopped you. Others are defending them. The media wants to hear from you directly." She leaned back in her chair. "And what do you think I should do?" The chief hesitated. "That's up to you. I think your voice could help if you're ready. People respect you. They'll listen." She was quiet for a long time, Speaking publicly wasn't something she took lightly. It wasn't about fame or attention. It was about responsibility. If her experience could help people see things differently, maybe it was worth it. "I'll do it," she said finally. "But not to blame anyone. I'll do it to remind people what respect really means." The interview was scheduled for later that week. When the day came, she sat across from a calm, soft-spoken journalist in a small studio. The lights were bright, the cameras ready, but she didn't let the setting bother her. She'd faced tougher rooms before: courtrooms, briefings, crisis meetings. This one, she told herself, was just another kind of truth. The interviewer began gently. "Captain, thank you for joining us. We've all seen the story online. Can you tell us what that moment was like for you? Being stopped in the store?" She nodded slowly, thinking back. "It was confusing at first," she said. "I knew I hadn't done anything wrong. But when I saw the look on their faces, I realized they had already made up their minds. They saw what they wanted to see, not who I was. I tried to stay calm, but inside it hurt." The interviewer leaned forward. "Did you ever think about revealing who you were right away?" "I did," she said. "But I wanted them to see me as a person first, not as a title. I wanted them to listen before labeling. But that didn't happen." There was a pause. "What lesson do you think people should take from this?" She smiled faintly. "That understanding should come before judgment. Whether you're a police officer or a regular person, everyone deserves to be treated with fairness. We forget sometimes that the uniform doesn't make us more human. It just gives us more responsibility." When the interview aired later that evening, it spread quickly. People across the country shared her words, praising her calmness and honesty. Some said her story reminded them of their own experiences, times when they'd been judged unfairly. Others thanked her for showing that strength didn't always have to be loud. At the department, the mood began to shift. The same officers who had once looked uncomfortable now looked at her with quiet respect. Even the two who had stopped her at the store came to her office in person. They knocked softly before stepping inside. "Ma'am," the older one said, clearing his throat, "we just wanted to apologize again. Not because we were told to, but because we realized how wrong we were to assume. We thought we were doing our job, but we didn't stop to think about how it felt for you." She stood up, meeting their eyes. "You made a mistake," she said. "But what matters now is that you learn from it. If this moment makes you more careful, more aware, then it's worth something." They nodded, visibly relieved. As they left, she sat back down, feeling a quiet sense of closure. Forgiveness didn't erase what happened, but it helped her move forward. A few days later, she received a call from the police academy. One of the instructors there had seen her interview and invited her to speak to the new recruits about her experience. She agreed without hesitation. Teaching was something she'd always valued, and she knew this story could teach more than any manual ever could. When she walked into the academy hall, dozens of young faces turned toward her. Some looked nervous, others eager. She stood at the front of the room, her hands resting lightly on the podium. "I'm not here to give a lecture," she began softly. "I'm here to tell you a story. A few weeks ago, I was off duty shopping like anyone else. 2 officers stopped me. They thought I was stealing. I wasn't angry, and I was disappointed, because in that moment I realized how easy it is to lose sight of empathy." She saw their faces change, the realization sinking in. "I've worn this badge for over 20 years, she continued. "It's supposed to stand for protection, not suspicion. But even we can forget that sometimes. So if there's one thing I want you to remember, it's this. Every person you meet has a story you don't know. Don't let your assumptions speak louder than your compassion." The room was quiet. Some recruits scribbled notes. Others just sat still, listening intently. After the session ended, a young trainee approached her. "Ma'am," he said shyly, "I think I understand now. It's easy to see people as suspects when you forget they're human first." She smiled. "That's exactly the point." That night, driving home, she felt a calm she hadn't felt in weeks. The city lights flickered past her windows, and the air was cool and still. She thought about how strange life could be, how a moment of humiliation could turn into a lesson for so many others. At home, she placed her badge on the table and stared at it for a while. It looked the same as always, but it meant something different now. It wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a reminder to stay human no matter the situation. Before going to bed, she checked her phone one last time. Messages kept coming, from strangers, officers, even people from other states. One read, Thank you for reminding us that decency still exists in this world. Another said, Your story changed the way I see things. She didn't reply to all of them, but she read each one carefully, feeling a quiet sense of gratitude. The next morning, when she stepped outside, she felt the crisp air against her face. The city was alive again. Cars rushing by, children heading to school, people carrying coffee cups as they hurried down the street. Life was moving forward, and so was she. Sometimes she thought things happen not because we deserve them, but because we need to learn from them. Maybe that day at the store wasn't meant to bring her down. Maybe it was meant to open her eyes a little wider. And as she got into her car, ready to start another day of work, she smiled to herself. The uniform didn't protect her from mistakes, but it gave her a chance to make them right. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real meaning of justice. Not perfection, but the courage to face imperfection with grace. Days passed, and the noise around the story started to fade, but the experience stayed with the captain. The department had moved on to other news, other calls, other shifts. Yet for her it was still quietly unfolding, shaping the way she looked at people, at her work, and even at herself. It was a late afternoon when she sat by the window in her office, the warm light of sunset falling across her desk. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly down the hallway outside. The station always felt different at this time, quieter, almost peaceful. She was writing her end-of-week notes when the chief stopped by her door. "Got a minute?" he asked, standing there with a folder in hand. She nodded, gesturing for him to come in. He placed the folder on her desk and leaned against the edge. "There's something I'd like you to look over. It's about the new community outreach program. We're thinking of making you the lead." She looked up, a little surprised. "Outreach?" He smiled faintly. "Yes. Given everything that happened and the way you handled it, we think you're the right person to rebuild some bridges between officers and the community." She paused, thinking it over. "That's a big responsibility," she said softly. "That's why I came to you," he replied. "People listen to you. You've seen both sides. What it's like to wear the badge and what it's like to be on the receiving end of assumptions. That perspective is powerful." She opened the folder and skimmed through the proposal. It included plans for workshops, school visits, and open discussions between officers and citizens. The idea was to create understanding, not through rules or lectures, but through simple conversations. She nodded slowly. "All right," she said. "I'll do it." The first event was scheduled a week later. It was held in a community center, a large hall with folding chairs arranged in a circle. There were officers on one side and local residents on the other. Some looked curious, others cautious. There was tension at first, a kind of invisible wall that no one wanted to be the first to cross. The captain stood in the middle, dressed in her uniform. She didn't start with a speech or a list of instructions. Instead, she spoke gently, her tone almost conversational. "I know some of you might feel uneasy sitting here," she began. "I understand. For many, it's hard to trust the people wearing this uniform. And for some of us in uniform, it's hard to be seen beyond it. But that's why we're here, to talk honestly as people." She then shared her story, not in a dramatic way, but with quiet honesty. She told them about that day at the store, about being mistaken for something she wasn't, about how it felt to be judged without being heard. "When it happened," she said, "I realized how quickly perception can turn into judgment. Even the people meant to protect can fall into that trap. But what I learned is this: understanding doesn't come from authority. It comes from empathy." The room was silent for a moment. Then slowly people began to speak. A woman raised her hand. "I've had times where I was stopped for no reason," she said. "I wasn't angry, but I was scared. I just wanted to be treated like a person." An officer across the circle nodded. "I've made mistakes too," he admitted quietly. "Sometimes we're so focused on doing our job that we forget there's a human being standing in front of us." And that was how it began. Small, honest exchanges that slowly melted away the walls between them. By the end of the session, people were talking freely, even laughing a little. When it was over, the captain stayed behind, helping pack up chairs. One of the young officers approached her. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I didn't think these meetings would work. But it felt good to actually listen, not just talk." She smiled. "And that's all people really want," she said. "To be heard." That night, as she drove home, she felt lighter. The city lights shimmered across the windshield, and for the first time in weeks, she caught herself humming softly to the radio. Over the next month, the outreach sessions continued. Each one brought new stories, some painful, some inspiring. She heard from people who'd lost trust in the system, from officers who wanted to make things right, from kids who dreamed of being police but were afraid of how others might see them. Each conversation made her believe a little more in the idea that small changes could lead to bigger ones, but not everyone in the department was supportive at first. A few older officers whispered that she was trying too hard to play politics or that she was softening the badge. She heard the comments, but she didn't respond. She'd learned long ago that change never comes easy, especially in places built on pride. One afternoon, she was walking down the station hallway when she overheard two officers talking. Near the break room, "She's just doing this to fix her image," one of them said, quietly. "She doesn't need to," the other replied. "She's the one who got embarrassed, and she's the one fixing everyone else's mistake." That's leadership, if you ask me. She kept walking, pretending not to hear, but inside, that small exchange meant more than she could say. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, she stood outside the station, looking up at the fading sky. A few recruits were walking to their cars, laughing about something, their voices echoing down the street. She smiled. They reminded her of herself when she first joined, full of hope, unsure of what the world would throw her way. That night, as she sat on her porch sipping tea, she thought about the journey so far. What began as a moment of humiliation had turned into something meaningful. She had spoken to hundreds of people now, officers, citizens, students, even journalists, all because of that one misunderstanding in a store. Sometimes life pushed you into uncomfortable places, she thought, not to punish you but to open your eyes wider. The next morning, her phone rang. It was the chief again. "Good news," he said cheerfully. "The city council wants to recognize your work with the outreach program. They're planning a small ceremony next week. Nothing fancy, just to thank you for helping rebuild trust." She chuckled lightly. "I didn't do it for awards." "I know," he said. "That's why you deserve it." The ceremony was held outdoors in front of the community center where it all began. A modest crowd gathered, officers, families, local residents. The mayor spoke briefly, thanking her for turning a difficult experience into a bridge between people. When it was her turn to speak, she didn't read from notes. She just spoke from her heart. "When I was stopped in that store," she said, her voice steady, "I felt what many people have felt before. Unseen, unheard, and misunderstood. I could have stayed angry. But instead I asked myself one question. What can I learn from this?" The answer was simple. Empathy. The kind that looks beyond titles, beyond uniforms, beyond assumptions. People nodded as she spoke. Some even clapped quietly. "When you see someone," she continued, "don't just see their mistakes or what you think they might be. See their story. Because sometimes one act of understanding can do more than any law or badge ever could." When the ceremony ended, people came up to shake her hand, thank her, take photos. But for her, the real reward wasn't the applause or recognition. It was the quiet feeling that things were changing. Little by little. That evening, she drove home with the windows slightly open, letting the cool air fill the car. She stopped at a red light and glanced out the window. Across the street, a young man was helping an elderly woman carry her groceries. She smiled to herself, watching the small act of kindness. It reminded her that goodness was still everywhere. It just needed space to show itself. As she pulled into her driveway, she turned off the car and sat for a moment, listening to the soft ticking of the engine. She thought about how far she had come, from being wrongly accused to becoming a voice for understanding. It hadn't been an easy path, but it was one she was proud of. She looked up at the sky, the stars faint but visible, and whispered softly to herself, maybe everything really does happen for a reason. And as she walked inside, closing the door behind her, she knew this wasn't the end of her story. Just another beginning, one built not on anger but on empathy, strength, and quiet courage. The days after the ceremony passed quietly, but they were far from ordinary. Life at the station returned to its usual rhythm: calls, reports, meetings, patrol updates. Yet something had changed. Officers looked at each other differently. more thoughtfully. The younger recruits she had mentored now treated the lessons from the outreach sessions as a compass, a reminder that empathy mattered as much as procedure. The captain herself felt lighter in ways she hadn't expected. The incident in the store, which had begun as a moment of humiliation, had grown into something meaningful. She realized that her role wasn't just about enforcing rules or managing officers. It was about setting an example of humanity, patience, and understanding. She thought often about the people she had met during the outreach programs. Citizens who had once viewed police with suspicion, officers who had never considered the consequences of assumptions, and even young students dreaming about the badge they might wear one day. One morning, she arrived at the station to find a small bouquet of flowers on her desk, along with a handwritten note. It was from the employees of the store, the ones who had first raised the alarm. The note read simply, "Thank you for showing us patience and understanding. We learned more from you than we realized." She held the note for a long moment. It reminded her that even the smallest gestures could change someone's perspective. Sometimes people needed to experience compassion to recognize it themselves. Later that week, she was asked to attend a city council meeting. They were considering a proposal to expand the community outreach program to include more neighborhoods, more schools, and even programs that involved parents and children. The council wanted her input, believing her experience could guide the program's direction. As she stood before the council, she felt the familiar weight of responsibility on her shoulders, but it was balanced by a quiet sense of purpose. She spoke calmly, explaining the importance of understanding, of listening before judging, and of creating spaces where people felt seen and respected. When people are assumed guilty before being heard, she said, it damages trust, not just between officers and citizens, but among people in general. We must work together to rebuild it one conversation at a time. Her words resonated. The council approved the proposal, expanding the program citywide. It was more than recognition. It was an opportunity to make a lasting difference. Back at the station, her colleagues began to notice changes in themselves. Officers were more careful, more thoughtful, and even casual interactions carried a new layer of respect. The two officers who had stopped her at the store approached her one afternoon, quietly in the hallway. "Ma'am," one said, "we've been trying to be more aware, like you said. Even small moments like checking IDs or questioning someone. We're thinking differently now. Your example made us see that." She nodded, smiling softly. "That's the point," she replied. "Change doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with awareness." Even outside the department, her story continued to ripple through the community. People who had seen the interview, the outreach sessions, or the council meeting shared it with friends and family. Some parents told their children about the captain who had handled embarrassment with grace. Some officers from other precincts reached out, asking how they could replicate similar programs in their own areas. One evening, she walked through the city park near her home. Children were playing, parents chatting, joggers passing by. A group of teenagers waved at her, recognizing her from a recent school visit. She waved back, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction. This was the result she had hoped for. Small connections, human moments, and trust being slowly rebuilt. Yet she never forgot the moment in the store. She often thought about how easily the situation had escalated, how quickly assumptions had been made, and how vulnerable anyone could feel when treated unfairly. It reminded her that even those who carry authority can experience humiliation, and that such experiences, if handled with dignity, could be turned into lessons not just for oneself, but for everyone around. A few weeks later, the department decided to recognize her contributions formally. A small ceremony was held in the station's training room, attended by officers of all ranks. The chief spoke first, praising her leadership, patience, and vision. Then she spoke, not as someone seeking recognition, but as someone reflecting on lessons learned.